Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot left, a crying woman at his ranch. In the midst of the white snow, sometimes a legend does not only bring fear, but also leaves behind a spark of hope. At the edge of a valley buried in snow, there stood a small ranch quiet as a final punctuation mark in the vastness of the West. The old wooden cabin, its roof faded to a silver gray, was the only place Elias Walker ever called home. For many years he lived alone with nothing but his cattle, his faithful horse, and a few memories that time could never erase. Each morning Elias led his horse into the misty fields, his calloused hands tying broken sections of fence, his eyes drifting toward the white-capped mountains in the distance. By evening he gathered hay-filled water for the herd and quietly rode home as the sun sank behind the range. Day after day unfolded the same, like a sorrowful tune repeating without end. People often said Elias was a hard man, yet behind those weathered eyes lay a pain no one else could see. Once he had a family, he once knew laughter around a supper table, but all of it was lost in an outbreak years ago. Since then, he chose a life apart, believing solitude was the price to keep a little honor in the land of his ancestors. But even the strongest cannot hide forever. On long nights when the wind sighed through the pines and distant hoofbeats echoed across the valley, his heart felt hollow, as if the whole world was nothing but darkness and the smoke of pine wood seeping through the cabin's cracks. In the town a day's ride away, folks sometimes whispered strange stories. They spoke of a giant figure moving in the forest, red eyes glowing in the mist, footprints pressed deep in snow twice the size of a grown man's. Some called it a beast, some believed it an ancient spirit. Most only shook their heads and murmured two words: Bigfoot. Elias usually ignored such talk. He never believed in monsters, nor in old legends. Yet now and then, when he led his horse by the tree line, he caught himself holding his breath as if unseen eyes were watching. Broken branches, faint impressions in fresh snow. They left a question lingering in his mind, one that never found an answer. Tonight the wind howled hard, carrying the sharp scent of burning pine. Elias sat before the fire, his hand gripping a rusty old ring, the only keepsake from a life long gone. Outside, wolves cried from afar, mingling with the roar of the storm through the pines, a world that seemed unchanging, until the legend itself walked into Elias's life, not with menace, but with a strange gift, one that began to shake the heavy walls of his solitude. Part 1. The Tracks in the Snow. That winter was harsher than most. The whole valley of the West was swallowed by white snow and biting wind, making each step across the pasture feel as heavy as carrying the weight of the mountains themselves. Elias Walker pulled his old leather coat tight, his hand gripping the reins as the horse moved slowly over the thick snow. Its breath came out in clouds of white against the frozen air, while the sound of hooves striking the ground echoed dry and lonely in the vast emptiness. Elias never gave up his habit of checking the pastures every morning, even on days when the world seemed buried alive beneath ice and storm. The herd needed guarding, the fences needed mending, and more than that, the work was how he filled the hollow places inside. The rhythm of labor repeated day after day had become the very breath of his life, harsh but familiar. But that morning something strange broke the rhythm. Among the usual horse tracks and scattered deer prints, Elias spotted a line of impressions pressed deep into the fresh snow. He pulled his horse to a halt and leaned down to study them. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Each print was twice the width of his hand, longer than the stride of a grown man. Toes showed clear like a human foot, but enormous, far beyond reason. He sniffed, slid his hand into his glove, and placed his palm against one of the tracks. The difference made him shiver. These weren't from a gray bear, theirs would show claws. Here there was only the shape of a bare foot, nor could they be from a man unless some giant walked barefoot through a winter like this. The thought made Elias let out a dry laugh, but the sound died quickly, leaving behind a heavy silence. Stories he had heard in the saloon flickered back to him. They spoke of a towering creature deep in the pine forests, each step shaking the ground, its breath like wind, howling through a mountain cave. Folks gave it many names, but the one that lingered most, whispered under whiskey's haze, was Bigfoot. Elias had always dismissed such tales. To him, they were nothing but inventions to pass the long nights. Yet here before his very eyes, the prince lay plain as day, leading from the deep woods to the pasture circling close to his ranch. His heartbeat slowed, heavy as stone. This no longer felt like a joke. He lifted his gaze, sweeping across the snowbound forest. Silence. Too much silence. Only the moan of the wind and the crack of branches somewhere far away. A chill crept along his neck, the sense of being watched from the dark. Beneath him, the horse tossed its head ears, twitching breath quick and sharp. Animals sensed things long before men, and Elias trusted their instincts. He tightened the reins, turning the horse to follow the tracks. They pressed deep and heavy, trailing across the edge of the field before vanishing into the thick stand of pines. Elias did not follow further. He knew well enough how recklessness could swallow a man whole, leaving him gone like so many wanderers before. Yet even as he reined in, part of him could not look away from those tracks. The loneliness that had clung to Elias for so many years now felt different. He had grown used to being alone. But now, he wasn't alone anymore. Whatever had left those prints was out there somewhere. And somehow it had come close enough to touch the line between the wild beyond and his solitary home. Back inside the cabin, Elias could not shake the thought of them. When he lit the fire, when he poured hot coffee, when the wind scraped against the window, always the image of those giant footprints returned, burned into his mind. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was chance, perhaps some cruel trick. But deep down, Elias knew his quiet, unchanging life had just been disturbed. Something was moving closer, something greater than the loneliness he had carried for so long. Part 2. The Shadow in the Mist. Night fell quicker than usual. Winter in the west was always merciless. The sun dropped behind the mountains in the blink of an eye, leaving the valley steeped first in ashen purple, then swallowed by solid black. Elias Walker fed more wood to the stove, the firelight flickering his shadow across the cabin wall. That fragile glow of gold was the only defense against the cold and the darkness outside. He sat in his old wooden chair, sipping bitter coffee, listening to the sounds of night. The wind moaned long through the pines, whistling through cracks in the walls, weaving into a strange, growling chorus. Elias was used to it. But tonight, something different threaded its way into the song. The wind broke uneven, as if interrupted by the heavy rhythm of footsteps. He froze, lifting his head. Out there in the thick of the night came the dry crack of a breaking branch, followed by a deep thud again and again. In the stall beside the cabin, his horse whinnied softly, pawing at the ground. Elias set down his cup and reached for the rifle on the wall. His calloused hands knew the weapon well, yet his palms beaded with cold sweat. He doused the oil lamp, leaving only the fire's faint crackle. The cabin sank into dim half-light. Elias eased open the window eyes, straining to pierce the curtain of night, the mist hanging thick as a veil. And then he saw it. At the edge of the woods, only a few dozen paces away, a towering shadow stood. Its form blurred in the fog, but clear enough for Elias to know it was no man, no bear. Shoulders broad as a wall chest, heaving with heavy breath, each exhale drifting white like smoke. The eyes, catching just a shimmer of moonlight, shone with a look Elias had never seen before. Not wholly fierce, not gentle either. His heart pounded hard. His fingers slid along the trigger, the rifle heavy in his grip. One shot could end it, banish the fear, drive away the threat. Yet Elias did not pull. He only stood there, gaze locked on the figure. Bigfoot did not advance. It remained still, silent, almost as if waiting. Wind swept through fog, curling thick, yet the massive form did not move. Elias felt a strange certainty if it had meant to attack, his chance to hesitate would already be gone. But it did not. The moment stretched like eternity. He heard his own heartbeat woven with the crackle of fire inside the cabin. And then he understood the rifle shook in his hands, not from fear, but from the pull of something else. A torn balance between survival and a fragile belief that the dark might hold more than danger. At last, Elias lowered the gun. He drew in a long breath, as though sending a signal of peace. The giant seemed to understand. It shifted just one step back, then stopped its breath, huffing strong through the fog. The gesture carried no threat, only a quiet warning. I am here, but I am not your enemy. Elias closed the window, his back pressing to the wooden wall. Outside, the footsteps faded, their heavy rhythm folding into the wind. Silence returned, broken only by the fire's whisper and his own breathing. But tonight the solitude he had long known was torn apart. Out there in the mist, a creature of legend had met his gaze, and instead of blood left only silent respect. Fragile yet so real, he could not deny it. He sat for a long while, rifle resting across his lap. He knew his life had changed. Not because the giant had vanished into the night, but because from now on he was no longer the only one living in this world. Some invisible thread had been drawn taut, tying him to the legend others only dared to whisper in town. The cold night drifted on. But inside that little wooden cabin, with pine smoke rising and firelight glowing, a quiet truth grew stronger. Elias Walker was no longer entirely alone. Part 3. The Woman in the Night. The night dragged on in heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the roar of the wind through the forest. Elias Walker still sat by the hearth, rifle resting across his lap. He tried to force himself to believe that the moment earlier had been nothing more than a trick of fatigue and loneliness. But his heart knew better. The giant shadow in the mist was no illusion. It was real. He was just about to rise and throw more wood on the fire when the sound came again. Heavy, deep, steady like the beat of a drum. But this time it wasn't just branches breaking far off. The footsteps grew clearer, drawing nearer to the cabin. Elias leapt to his feet, rifle in hand, his heart thundering. The door trembled slightly, not from the wind, but from something brushing against the step. Elias narrowed his eyes through the crack of the window, the firelight inside flickering against the veil of mist outside. And then he saw it. A towering figure loomed right on the porch. It was Bigfoot, this time not standing far off, not merely watching, but stepping up to his very door. Moonlight pierced the fog, outlining its massive form, fur matted with snow, each breath pouring white clouds into the night. But what struck Elias most was not the creature's size, it was what it carried in its arms. Cradled against its chest was a woman. Her dress, torn and soaked with snow, clung to her frail body. Her hair fell loose, hiding half a pale face. One thin hand clutched the giant arm that held her. Her head hung low, her shoulders shaking with muffled sobs. Elias froze. The sight shattered everything he thought he knew. The legend whispered in saloons, the beast painted in fearsome colors, was now delivering into his care a human being. A woman, exhausted, fragile, weeping in the snow. The door creaked open. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking deep into the drift. The wind slapped against his face, sharp and cold, but his shock numbed him to everything else. He raised the rifle on instinct, yet his arm would not hold steady. Before him, the giant bent low, setting the trembling woman gently upon the wooden steps. The only sound was her crying, weak, broken, but strong enough to pierce through the hardened shell Elias had worn for so long. The woman clutched herself, shoulders quaking. Her hand clawed at the porch floorboards as if reaching for something to keep from sinking. Elias crouched, moonlight glinting across her face, pale skin, eyes blurred with tears, frozen trails of sorrow caught at the corners. He looked up again at Bigfoot. The creature did not snarl, did not lunge. It only stood, eyes deep and dim in the moonlight, holding Elias's gaze a moment longer, then giving the faintest nod, a gesture so strange Elias wondered if he was dreaming. His heart beat hard, not with fear, but with something else. Something like understanding. Elias knelt beside the woman, pulling off his coat to wrap around her shoulders. She trembled, tried to speak, but only sobs came. He placed a rough, steady hand on her shoulder and whispered, "It's all right. You're safe now." The words startled him. He had not spoken comfort to another soul in all his years of solitude. Yet here, on a snowy night, he was saying it to a stranger, one delivered to him by the very legend he had denied all his life. Bigfoot stepped back. Its heavy footsteps rumbled once more, then faded into the mist. Elias lifted his eyes just in time to see its immense shape dissolve into the night. His cabin, once a place of solitary refuge, had become in the eyes of a legend, a beacon, a place where it had chosen to leave a fragile human life. Elias carried the woman inside. Her body was cold to the bone, her breath faint. He laid her near the hearth, covered her with blankets, and set a bowl of hot water by her side. In the fire's glow, her features came clearer, face streaked with dirt, hands scraped raw lips blue with cold. And still on her closed eyes tears glistened, not yet dry. Elias sat close, his heart stirring with a tide he had not felt in years. For so long he believed he would end his life in silence, with no one to need and no one to need him. Yet tonight, beneath the howl of the wind and the smoke of pine wood, there lay a fragile soul, shivering beneath his roof, delivered into his care by a shadow of legend. He did not know if he should fear it, resent it, or thank it. Only one truth stood clear from the moment he heard her cry pierce the snowy night: Elias Walker no longer lived for himself alone. Part 4. Elias's Choice. The wind howled through the forest, carrying shards of snow like 1,000 needles piercing the night. Elias Walker's cabin stood as the lone beacon in the storm, its firelight spilling golden warmth across rough wooden walls. Outside, nature was merciless and cold. Inside, a fragile life lay shivering, clinging to the last traces of warmth. The woman lay curled on a rug near the hearth, her body trembling, still her face pale and tinted blue from the cold. Elias stood over her, the rifle heavy in his hand. His grip tightened around the stock, his eyes flicking again and again toward the window, where the fog pressed thick against the darkness. Somewhere out there, deep in the trees, the legendary beast still lingered. Inside his mind raged a storm fiercer than the one outside. On one side, instinct urged him to bar the door, to keep the gun close, to be ready for the moment the creature returned. On the other, fragile but persistent, echoed the memory of sobs, the vision of thin shoulders trembling as Bigfoot placed the woman gently upon his porch. Elias looked down at her. Her hand twitched faintly, clutching the edge of the thin blanket. Half conscious, she muttered words he could not make out, only a broken sound trembling in her throat. Elias's chest tightened. One pull of the trigger could banish the threat outside, but it would leave behind a life inside too fragile to survive on its own. He shut his eyes, drew in a deep breath, and when he opened them again, Elias lowered the rifle. With a thud against the wooden floor, it fell, the sound echoing in the cabin like a verdict. He had made his choice. Not fear, not suspicion, compassion. A part of him he thought long dead. Elias shrugged off his coat and spread it over the woman. The rough leather carried little heat, but his body's warmth still lingered there. He added a heavy blanket atop it, tucking it around her, then filled a pot with water and hung it over the flames. Soon the bubbling of boiling water mixed with the crackle of pine wood, and the faint scent of smoke and broth drifted through the cabin, a rare breath of comfort in the long night. Even as he worked, Elias felt it, that distant weight of eyes upon him. He stepped to the door, easing it open. The night was still wild, the wind still sharp, but there at the edge of the mist, he saw the massive shape. Bigfoot. Standing still, not approaching, only watching. Moonlight laid silver across its fur, blurring its form into something between shadow and dream. In that moment, Elias saw no enemy. He saw waiting, perhaps even trust. The creature had carried the woman here and now lingered, watching to see what he would do with the fragile gift it had placed in his care. Elias understood then: Bigfoot had chosen him. Not another, not the wilderness, but him. Elias gave a single faint nod, and as if answering, the giant stepped back. Slowly, deliberately, it faded into the fog. Heavy footsteps softened, then vanished, leaving the forest to the wind and the fire's quiet song. Elias closed the door, bolted it, and returned inside. The soup simmered, the humble smell of dried meat and roots filling the cabin. He ladled a bowl, blew gently, then held a spoon to the woman's lips. Her eyes fluttered open, wet and glimmering in the firelight. Elias spoke in a low, steady voice, warmer than he had heard from himself in years. "Drink. It'll bring the warmth back." She trembled, swallowing one small sip, then another. A soft sigh escaped her lips, a faint sign of life returning. Elias set the bowl aside and sat near her. His hand, rough and calloused, shook faintly as he adjusted the blanket, tucking her safely within it. In the glow of the flames, shadows played along the cabin walls, and Elias felt a truth rising within him by lowering the rifle he had saved not just her, but himself. After years of exile in solitude, his heart had opened, if only a little. Beyond the cabin walls, Bigfoot had disappeared into the mist, but its presence lingered still, like a silent promise. Tonight, Elias did not face the darkness alone. Strange though it was, unbelievable though it seemed, a bond had been woven between a man haunted by his past, a creature of legend, and a woman entrusted to him by fate. Fan 5, Ngoy, Gach, Rang Vo Hunh. Nung gay sa jokon baun tuyet van kwan thao thong lung, nung ben trong cabin gunokwa Elias Walker ngon lua van chai giu cho susongamap. Ngoy pu numa Bigfoot mang jen dan hoi puk. Landa tain hot hom naujan hong tro lai joy moi timingat giotin thuang henukoi yuot ki Elias jua chokobat sup nong koten la clara. Trong hung kwan kakting tao hon clara kelai kau chuyen kwa min. Kokungia jin vo dai nui ve huang dai hibong tim juak mot manjat moi jabat jao. Nung kon bao bat ngo ab jen ngwa lakse vo va kobi kuon va rung sao. Bangya va bong jem han chong hien ko ket sukng hirang min se mai nam lai noi rungya. Roy, toi thai no clara ron noi joy mat nangan kin holai. Mot bong kong lo. Toi tuong, latan kung, nhong no kong hai toi, no chibe toi len no, nhumot juat relak, Elias lang nangoy, ong tung ang hebao loy John toi ve Bigfoot kwai tu an thit bong magiorat kin huang, nhong clara mot han chung song lai mot anon hu vikuting, ong ngoy lang bantai gon han hebao tan gemat toi rangwai kwa so pusong, ngwai kia kan rong van to kongyo, song bak fu dai an chuan hang bimat makon ngoy chua tung cham toi. Elias bong tain han thukua min joy kach Bigfoot kong pai la ke san moi kong pai la huyan thoai je biso hai. No gyong humot ke gach rongam tham kwan sat joy kira tai kong pai je pa hui ma je giu chokan bang kong bijut gai. Iin hi ai kien Elias mat ngun hiu jem. Ong buok rahian hin vao hoang rung suong motrong long wang len mot thoi thuk. Ong no hong chibi janku clara ma vi jantra lai cho ong mot fan kon ngoi ma ong tuang javin vien. Shon vui ka nang tin tuang ka nang baove. Mot buoy sang ki matroy kon chua kip she tuak man suong dai Elias koak, ao dat ngwara bia rong. Trong tai ong la mot mon kwa John gian mot man kon len kwa me ong jason kun hung bangiu hoi amva mot fan thokan ong goy gon. Ong ja chung tren mot tang jalon noi dao chang kong lo tung in han. Elias jong joim lang. Gio thoilan bo tu yet ke roi pu len vai ao ong. Ong kong mong mot suksuat hien kong mong mot kau tra loi ro rang. Ong shimon jelai dao hiu kwa long bieton. Va roi ki ong kwai lung jin buok jimotam tan nang ne wang len. Tung hip tu sao trong rung wong lai. Elias dung buok soai ngoi. Giwa man swong ong thuang tai bong dang tolon mo ao. Kong tien lai gan kong len tieng chi jong lang. Va roi mot jong tak chamrai bat ngo bong ai ke kui jao. Kuchi jon gian hung juje Elias nghen lai. Jo hong fai loi je doa kung chang fai su chao jon. Jo la su kong han mot giao wok vo hin giwa hai de gioi. Kon goi va huyen thoai tu nai se chia se kung mot hong gian bang su ton trong. Elias yet chat tai, roigat jau jap lai. Kingang len bong hong lo jambien mat vao suong. Trentang jamon kwa ong van nam jon hung dao chan moi in sao vao tu yet chotai no jan dat su hong fai au an. Trovi kabin Elias tai klaranguyan hoi to jeo jan guong mat bintan. Nang kon lua van chai ruk trong la. Ong ang goik suong ghekam han long min kach la. Ko John van kon hong kong kon tu et vong. Noi jau ksua ko van hindian hong gyo jai jot koa lap boy mot soi dai noi ong voi mot truyen tu et ma eat eitin hong ong biet la ko that. Tu hom jo Elias kong kon hin rong hukik sala. Moila nang hetieng gyo hutien kan gai ong kong kon rong min trong so hai ma lang le mim koi. Boyong biet ngwai kia trong lop suang dai ko mot ke gach rong jang doi theo kong fai ke tu ma lang ngwai jong han vo hin. Part 5. The Invisible Guardian of the Forest. In the days that followed, the snowstorm continued to batter the valley. Yet inside Elias Walker's small wooden cabin, the fire burned steadily, keeping life warm and alive. The woman whom Bigfoot had delivered slowly began to recover. The pallor of her skin gave way to a faint flush of color, and her lips, once blue with cold, now sometimes curled into the hint of a fragile smile when Elias handed her a bowl of hot soup. Her name was Clara. In moments of clarity, she told her story. She had been traveling west with her family, crossing the mountains in search of new land and a fresh beginning. But the storm struck without warning. Horses' scattered wagons broke, and Clara was swept into the depths of the forest. The cold and the darkness drained her strength, and she believed she would be lost forever among the trees. Then, I saw it. Clara whispered, her voice trembling, her eyes glistening as she remembered. A giant shadow. I thought it was the end, but it didn't hurt me. It only lifted me up like a lost child. Elias was struck silent. He had heard the rumors in town for years. Bigfoot the predator, Bigfoot the terror haunting the woods. Yet Clara, a living witness, described not a monster, but a savior. Elias sat quietly, his rough hand tapping the arm of his chair, his gaze drifting toward the mist-covered window. Outside, the forest breathed with the wind. Silver fog clung thick, hiding secrets no man had ever touched. Something shifted in Elias's understanding. Bigfoot was not a hunter, nor a nightmare to be feared. It was more like a guardian of the wild, watching silently, stepping in at times not to destroy, but to preserve balance. The thought unsettled Elias, stealing his sleep for nights on end. He found himself drawn to the porch, staring into the foggy tree line, a weight pressing at his chest. He owed it not only for saving Clara, but for giving back a piece of himself he thought forever buried, the ability to trust, the will to protect. One morning before the sun had pierced the mist, Elias saddled his horse and rode to the forest's edge. In his hand, he carried a simple gift, a worn woolen scarf that had belonged to his mother, still holding the memory of warmth, and a small bundle of food wrapped with care. He placed them on a large stone where the giant footprints had once pressed deep into the snow. Elias stood still, silent. The wind cut sharp against his face, snow dusted over his shoulders. He did not expect an answer. He did not seek an appearance. He only wished to leave behind a sign of gratitude. And then, as he turned to go, a sound rolled through the trees. Heavy, rhythmic, footsteps. Elias froze, turning back. Through the curtain of mist, he glimpsed a vast figure. It did not advance. It did not speak. It only stood there. And then a single, slow movement. The giant bowed its head. The gesture was simple, yet it struck Elias to the core. It was not a threat, nor a welcome. It was recognition, a silent pact between two worlds. Man and legend bound now by respect. Elias's hand clenched at his side, and he gave a nod in return. When he lifted his eyes again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog. On the stone, his gift remained, but fresh tracks in the snow told him it had truly been there. Back at the cabin, Elias found Clara sleeping peacefully, her breath steady, her face calm. The fire roared warmly in the hearth. Elias sat down in his chair, feeling a change within. Loneliness still lingered, but without despair. Old grief remained, but was softened by something new, a thread connecting him to a legend few dared believe, but one he knew to be real. From that day on, Elias no longer looked at the forest as a stranger. Each time the wind howled or branches snapped, he did not shudder in fear. Instead, he smiled quietly, for he knew that out there behind the veil of mist, an unseen guardian was watching, no enemy but a silent companion. The storm still raged outside, rolling across the valley in endless waves of white. Pines bent under the whistling wind, their branches heavy with snow. Yet amid that frozen sea, Elias Walker's cabin glowed like a lighthouse, a single warm flame shining against the mist of the forest. Elias stood on the porch, his breath mingling with the silver fog. In his hand rested an old ring, the only relic of the family he had lost. Slowly, he turned it between his calloused fingers, the cabin's firelight catching on the rusted metal. Behind him, through the half-closed door, came the steady, peaceful breathing of Clara, the woman fate had brought to him in the arms of a legend. He lifted his gaze into the night. Out there, he saw nothing but darkness and snow yet. In his heart, he knew an unseen presence was still watching. No longer a threat, no longer a beast to be feared, but the quiet spirit of a guardian, distant, solemn, yet strangely merciful. Elias whispered, his voice rough yet gentle, as though speaking both to himself and into the mist. Not every shadow means harm. Some legends heal. The words dissolved into the wind, but they left behind a rare peace within him. In the Wild West, where men wrestled with nature and the darkness in their own hearts, there was still room for kindness. And that kindness, Elias realized, was the bridge between man and the unknown, whether it came in the shape of a myth or a soul lost in the storm. He stepped back inside and closed the door. The fire sang cheerfully in the hearth, lighting Clara's sleeping face with warmth. Elias sat down, the old ring resting in his palm, and allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. For the first time in many years, the cabin no longer felt like an empty shell echoing with the wind. Now it held life, hope, and a quiet promise that he would never be entirely alone again. Outside, Bigfoot had faded into the forest, but its footprints remained etched in Elias's heart, not as scars of fear, but as markers of a new beginning. In the Wild West, amid harshness and shadow, it was compassion that proved to be the fragile yet unshakable bridge between humankind and the realm of legend. If this story has touched you, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the journeys ahead, and continue with us where legends meet the human heart.